Hello wonderful people! Today we're going to be drawing a spring lake landscape, and trust me, it is way easier than it looks. And for this video, I personally will be working in Procreate, as you can see here, but you can follow along this tutorial with any digital art software of your choice, as long as you have a selection tool and a basic round brush. That's really all that you need here, and I'm going to give you tips on how to find different features in a different software as well. So grab your drawing tools and let's get started. So the way we're going to approach this illustration is we're going to start with very basic rough shapes, mapping out everything at first, starting with the back, coming towards the front. And once we've reached the front, we're just going to do another pass, this time with smaller details, until we're done with everything. So essentially we're just going to do a few passes of back to front. So we're going to start with just very basic rough shapes. So I'm going to go ahead and hide my example here. Now obviously for this video, if you want, you can pick your own colors, but if you want to follow along with me and use the same colors I will be using, you can find my color palette in the video description. It is totally free, so feel free to pause the video here, go ahead and download that, and once you have it in your software, no matter what the software is, you can just start the video again, and we're going to get started with the sky. So the sky is actually going to be two colors, but we're going to start with just one, which is going to be the color here on the very top left. And we're going to put that color over everything. So you can just go ahead, create a new layer, rename that new layer to sky, and then drop your blue onto that sky, or onto that layer, I should say. Great. Now from there, we're going to start mapping out the shapes, starting with the mountains in the background, so the big pointy ones. So go ahead and create a new layer above the sky, of course, and rename that new layer to mountains. Now the mountains are going to be a slightly darker blue than the one we used for the sky, so the sky was this one right here. For the mountains, we're going to go with the one right next to it, which as you can see is still quite pale, but it's a little bit darker and it's a bit more blue than aqua. And here, to draw these basic shapes, you could go with something like a round brush or a square brush if you want, maybe even an inking brush. But to keep it super simple, I'm just going to block in these big shapes just using a selection tool. That is a great technique when you have super rough shape that you just want to quickly add to your piece. So that's exactly what I'm personally going to do. So if you're working in Procreate, the selection tool is right here at the top. And one thing you want to make sure though, if you're using the selection tool technique, is to set your selection tool to freehand so that you can draw your selection freely. So the shape of the mountain is totally up to you. I'm going to draw three main mountains. They're all going to be quite pointy, and they're all going to be slightly different heights. So once you have the actual top of the mountain, you're just going to close your selection by bringing it down. And you're going to bring these mountains roughly a little bit lower than the middle of the piece. Then bring it around and closing your selection. Now from there, super easy. All you have to do is drop your color to fill it in. Now, if there's something you really do not like at this stage, you could go ahead and either add some more sections and fill in more shapes or use your eraser to tweak the shape. But I recommend for now leaving it like that, because as we keep building the piece, we're going to get more information on the different shapes we have. So for now, I would really just advise you to leave it like this, and we can always come back and play with the different shapes later down the road. So the next thing we're going to draw, moving up a little bit closer to us, we're going to have some hills that are going to be covered in trees later. For now, they're just plain hills. So go ahead and create a new layer above the mountains and rename that new layer to hills. Now these hills are going to be a more intense blue that has a little bit of green in it, because again, it's going to have trees on these hills later. And that blue is right here in the color palette to the right of the blue we just used for these mountains. And same thing here, we're just going to use either a round brush, a square brush, or a selection tool. I'm going to stick with my selection tool. And this time we're going to draw two hills, one on both sides essentially. And the top, or the top edge of these hills, is going to be kind of these wiggly shapes that are going to become trees later. Otherwise, again, the shapes are totally up to you, so experiment with them a little bit, make them your own, and just have fun with the process in general. Then you close the selection and fill in the silhouette. Now, one thing I recommend doing though is cleaning up this line so it's actually a straight horizontal line. And for that, it is hard, I find, to do that with a selection tool, so you can just use a basic round brush. If you're working with Procreate, that would mean going in the airbrushing pack that comes with the app and picking the hard brush, making sure the opacity of the brush is at 100%. Now, if you're working with a different software, again, just the most basic circle brush you have in your software is really what you're going for here. And then with that, you're just going to draw a straight line to clean up that bottom edge. Now, if you're working with Procreate, there's a really nice trick that you can use, which is once you draw your line, just hold the pencil on the screen. It's going to straighten your line, and then tap with another finger, and it's going to make that line fully horizontal. Great. Now from there, we're going to keep moving forward. So the next thing we're going to draw is a cherry blossom tree in the kind of the middle ground, I guess, or almost the foreground. So go ahead and create a new layer and rename that new layer to Tree. Now here I'm going for a full bloom cherry blossom tree, so kind of a sakura vibe. And so it's going to be a bright pink, but honestly you could have a completely different type of tree here. That's a very easy way to customize the piece. That being said, if you do want to have a cherry blossom tree as well, we're going to pick this super bright pink right here in the color palette. Almost white, but there's a little bit of that baby pink in it. And you could still work with the selection tool here if you wanted to, but I'm not gonna lie, I find it really hard to create soft, nice curves with a selection tool. So for fluffy things like clouds and trees, I personally just like to use an actual brush. So for that, you have a few different options. Of course, you could just stick with the hard brush if you're working with a different software or with free Procreate brushes. But if you do have a drawing brush that you know you like, or an inking brush that you know you like, you could also just go with that, because that might give you a little bit more control. So in the case of this video, when I'm not using the selection tool, which is going to be for most of the shapes, I'm going to use brushes from my inking, stippling, and texture bundle. These brushes are not essential at all, but they can maybe help you get more professional results and have more control over what you're drawing than just basic brushes. So if you do want to check them out, they will be linked in the description below, and there's always a special promo code for the YouTube people, but again, they are not essential at all. If you do have that bundle though, we're going to pick from the inking pack that comes with it, the bonus base round brush. Now all of that to say, we're going to draw the tree. And for the tree, I'm just going to draw a cloud shape. And I like to start with very big section of the cloud shapes, or cloud shape, and then coming back in and refining the shape by adding extra little petals and stuff like that. So I'm really just going to go with this kind of big pink blob to start with. And then I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller. The exact number is, really not important, but I'm going to come back in and add some extra little blobs poking out of the main shape. Not too much though, you don't want to overdo it, but just a few can really help make it look a little bit more like a tree and less like a pink cloud. You could also draw in like a second section, like there's a group of leaf there and there might be another secondary group from a secondary branch. So same thing, starting with a basic cloud shape and then adding some details to it. Great. Now we're also going to draw some branches over the tree, obviously, because right now it just looks very, very weird. And you could draw these branches on the same layer as the tree if you want, but I like to keep my layers separate for now because when we come back in and add the extra shapes and the gradients and the shadows, it is helpful to have everything as separated as possible. So in my case, again, I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to put that new layer above the tree, and I'm going to rename it to branches. Now the branches obviously are going to be a nice brown, so in the color palette I'm going to pick this one right here at the bottom of the pink column. And here you could stick with the same basic round brush or hard brush, whatever brush you were using. Again, here it's really not about the brush, it's just about finding what you're comfortable with, even if that means just one selection tool or just one basic round brush. That being said, I know that in my inking, stippling, and texture bundle, there is one brush that I really like and I think would work well for the flow of the branch, and that brush is the Ultra Smooth Tracing. If you're working with Procreate and you don't have my bundle, you could experiment with different brushes from the inking pack that comes with that app, such as the Studio Pen. And if you're working with a different software, you could try to find something that has the word inking or pen in the name. Usually those could be good alternatives. But again, in my case, from the inking pack that comes with my bundle, the Ultra Smooth Tracing is what I'm going to go for. And I'm just going to add some very curvy, flowy branches. I'm going to add one here for this section of the tree. And then another one slightly higher for the main part of the tree. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please go ahead and leave me a comment with the word lake. Now, if you're confused with what is the secret password thing, essentially it's a game that we play here on the channel. In all the long form tutorials, I hide a secret password. Sometimes it's just a word, sometimes it's a question for you to find. And whenever you do leave a comment with that secret password, believe it or not, it does give me a lot of insight into how to edit and paste my videos better, which helps me create better tutorials for you. So once more, if you've watched this far, just go ahead and leave me a comment with the word lake, and we're going to keep going. Making sure that you have different thicknesses within the branches themselves. So the main branches should be thicker, obviously, and the secondary branches should be a little bit thinner. And the next and last thing we're going to do for the super basic rough shapes is just drawing kind of a grassy hill or grassy section in the front to add a lot of depth to the piece. And so go ahead and create a new layer above everything, of course, and rename that new layer to grass. Now I want to add some color. I want to make that piece look super vibrant and kind of spring. So I'm going to use a bright green. You could go with something a little bit more muted if you want. And the green I'm going to use is right here in the color palette. It's the single green on this column right there. Again, quite yellowy. I really want something that pops. And for this, I'm going to go back to just my selection tool, and I'm just going to draw a super simple curve on the bottom right of the canvas. Closing the selection and filling in the shape. Now, before we move on to the next step, it is worth taking the time to come back in and refine the different shapes now that we have the main structure of the piece. So again, what that could mean is just using an eraser set to a hard brush. So either if you're working with free Procreate brushes, the hard brush that comes with the airbrushing pack. If you're working with a different software, just a basic round brush. Or if you were working with my inking, stippling, and texture bundle, we can set the eraser to the bonus base round brush. So with that, you could erase, for example, I don't know what I could want to erase here. Maybe this point is a little bit too, I don't know, it looks like an ice cream cone, like a soft serve ice cream. So maybe going back on my mountains layer and erasing that a little bit. So really just going over all the different shapes you have and either adding more to that shape or erasing part of the shape. I'm realizing now, having this tree, we don't see the third mountain, so I'm actually going to come back in with my selection tool and just draw another summit here. Super quick and easy. I can color pick the color I use for the mountains or go back in the color palette and then just drop that onto my selection to add an extra shape. So feel free to pause the video here, take all the time you need to play with these basic rough shapes. It shouldn't be too hard, but it's worth making sure that you're happy with the basic structure at this stage. Great, so once you're happy with your basic shapes, we're going to come back and do a second pass, one more starting with the back and coming towards us. And this pass this time is going to be mostly adding some gradients just to make these basic shapes a little bit more interesting. So the first one we're going to do is just adding a gradient in the sky, so super easy. You can go back on the sky layer if you want and just draw your gradient there, or you can create a new layer just so you have a little bit more control over what you're doing. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm not going to rename that new layer though, because once I'm done with that step, I'm just going to merge them both together. Now to add gradients, you have a few different techniques that you can use. If you're working in a software that has a gradient tool, you could just use that gradient tool and quickly add a gradient. Unfortunately, in Procreate, we don't have that feature, so we have to use an alternative technique, which is super easy as well. And essentially that technique is just drawing a selection, filling the selection, and then adding some blur. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. But of course, if you do have a gradient tool in your software, just use that instead right at the gate. So the gradient we're going to create is not super realistic, but it's going to really make the piece pop. We're going to add this really pale lime gray at the bottom of the sky. So in the color palette, that lime gray is right here under the sky color. Otherwise, again, we're just going to use the selection tool, setting it to freehand to draw a little bit of a blob at the bottom of the sky. Closing the selection, you're then going to fill in the shape. And right now it looks crazy, but we're going to, again, add a blur to create a gradient. And the way to do that is just finding really any blur you have in your software. In Procreate, the blur options are here in the adjustment panel. In this middle section here, we have 3 options. The one I prefer is Gaussian blur, so that's what I'm going to go for, but you can experiment with the other ones as well if you wanted to. So Gaussian blur, and from there you can add some blur by swiping your finger towards the right, and reduce the blur by swiping it towards the left. So the exact amount is totally up to you. I recommend having it not completely blended that you really don't see much of the gradient anymore, but blended enough that you don't see too harsh of a line. So probably around 40% is what I'm going to go for. Great. Now, once you're happy with everything, you can just go ahead and merge the layers. The reason I like to keep them separate is so that we can maybe resize them or erase some elements as needed. For example, if you felt like your gradient was going too high up, you could just use your selection tool, making sure it's set to either freeform or distort, something that allows you to change the proportions essentially. And you could just squish it or extend it, change the amount of green you have in the sky. I was really happy with what I had, so I'm just going to keep it like that. And then I'm going to merge my sky and that gradient by just squishing the 2 layers together with my fingers. So the next thing we're going to do is repeating that exact same technique with a slightly different color, but this time between the mountain and the hill to create a bit of fog. So once more, you can just create a new layer. No need to rename it because we're going to squish it. And for that fog, we're going to go with this kind of grayish blue right here, right under the color we used for the mountains. Otherwise, same thing, selection tool, hard brush, whatever you want that allows you to block the color. We're going to block a blob at the bottom of the mountains. We're going to close the selection and then fill in the shape with our color. And it's okay if it pokes out of these hills because we're going to need to come back and erase anyway. When we add the blur, it's going to make that shape come out of the hill, so we're just going to come back in and erase that in a second. Not a big deal, but before that we're actually going to add the blur itself. So adjustment panel here, Gaussian blur, and then swiping towards the right to add blur or towards the left to reduce the blur. So once more, you don't want it to be completely soft but not too harsh either. Here I think I'm going to go with 35. Now, because we have it on a separate layer as well for now, you could also play with the opacity of the layer. Like I feel like my fog is a little bit too dark. So I'm actually going to just lower the opacity of that layer by tapping on the little N next to the check mark. And just playing with that slider here. I'm probably going to set mine around, I'm going to go with 83. Now before I merge everything, I'm just going to come back in and erase that bottom section of the fog. So just picking my eraser, making it quite big, and erasing any spillage. And from there, otherwise super easy, you can just come back in and merge that fog with your mountains. Now we're also going to use the same technique to add some texture or some gradient on the hills, but the hills we're going to add a darker gradient this time. So you can just use the same technique, meaning creating a new layer above the hills, but this time instead of going lighter, we're going to darker, and the color we're going to use here, quite hard to see because it's very similar to the one, the background, the color palette, but it's at the bottom of this column right here. And we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to create a blob at the bottom of the hills, fill in our shape, add some blur. This time I would say probably around 30% instead of 40% because we're coming closer to us. We're going to start seeing things that are a little bit more precise, so every element is going to be a little bit smaller and more defined. I might actually come in here and distort mine to squish it in a little bit. Yeah, something like that. And then I'm going to come in with my eraser and I'm going to erase what's spilling out. And then of course we're just going to come in and merge that hill with that new kind of shaded gradient that we created. Now we're going to do something very similar for the tree, but instead of being a gradient, it's going to be more of a solid shape. There's going to be a little bit of gradient within it, but not too much. And instead of being on just one section, it's going to be in the middle. So what you're going to do is, once more, you're going to create a new layer above the tree. You're going to go with a darker version of the pink. So in the color palette, it's this one right here, and it's quite a bit darker, and it's also more of a salmon than pink, so it has a bit more orange in it. And you could, again, just use the selection tool if you wanted to, or go back to a round brush if you have more control with that kind of tool for curves like I do. So that's what I'm going to do. Just going back with my base round brush here. And here, all you're going to do is you're going to draw out pretty much the same shape that you have, but a little bit more inside. So there's going to be a gap between this darker pink and the actual edge of the tree. And I say almost the same shape. It really doesn't need to be the exact same shape, but roughly following that shape. As you can see, that's definitely not perfect, but that's close enough. I'm going to do the same thing on that lower section as well. If you are enjoying this tutorial so far, please consider helping the channel by giving this video a like and subscribing if you haven't already. Now, I know everyone on YouTube is asking you to do that, but believe it or not, it does help us and our channels a lot because it just tells YouTube to take the video and show it to more people. So thanks for helping. Just like that. Now this looks quite crazy though, and the reason for that is it gets super dark and blotchy and it just doesn't really look like a tree. So we're going to start by adding a little bit of blur, not a lot, really just the tiniest little bit. And we're also going to dramatically lower the opacity of that layer so it blends in a little bit better with the rest of the tree. So I'm probably going to set it around 60%, but that's a question of personal preference. And you could also come in with an eraser and erase some of the edges to really make it a little bit softer. Now here you can use any eraser of your choice, of course, but I recommend going with something soft so you can create that gradient. So if you're working with free Procreate brushes, that would mean going in the airbrushing pack that comes with the app and picking the soft brush. In a different software, any kind of soft brush or round brush that has some feathering is going to work perfectly fine for this. But if you do have my inking, stippling, and texture bundle, we have a couple different options that we can play with, both in the texture and grit pack. Either the Bake Soft Layer Builder, if you want something super soft, Or if you want to add a little bit of grit, you could experiment with something like the soft grit. So the idea here is really just coming over the different edges and erasing them a little bit. Great, and once you're satisfied, you can just come in and merge these two layers. Now we're also going to add a gradient on the branches, but the branches are quite precise. I'm going to show you a different way to add gradient, especially if you're working with Procreate. That works really, really well, and that way doesn't require creating a new layer. So we're just going to select the branches layer itself. We're going to use our selection tool here, still setting it to freehand. And this time we're going to draw a blobby selection on the bottom left of these branches, closing the selection. And to create the same gradient effect that we had before, we're going to feather the section we have. So using feather here at the bottom, we're probably going to feather the section same amount we use for the blur, so something around 30 and 40%. And then you can just come in here with a darker version of your brown. So in the color palette, I'm going to pick this one right here. And then drop that onto the shape. Now, if you don't have this feathering selection option in your software, not a big deal. You can just use the same technique that we used before, but I want to show you if you're working with Procreate, this is another way that you can use to create gradients without having to create multiple layers. But by doing that, you don't have the same control to, for example, squish the sky gradient or squish the mountain gradients, kind of like I did before in the piece. Now the last few gradients we're going to add are going to be on the grass, and for that I'm going to use the same technique I use for the branches just to show it to you again. But if you don't have that selection feathering option available in your software, again, just use the same technique that we used for the mountains and the sky. In my case though, I am working in Procreate, so yes, I'm going to use that technique, going back on the grass layer, using a selection tool, and here I'm going to start by drawing one section on the top of the grass. Feathering that selection around probably 25% here. And coming back in with a lighter, yellower version of the green. So in the color palette, I do not have it, I will add it. So when you work with the color palette, it's going to be in there. So I'm just going to create it real quickly. Let's go with that. I'm going to add it here, but you can just drag that onto your shape. And if you want, you can also add a darker, more blue gradient at the bottom of the grass. So using the same technique, whichever one you've been using. And this time coming in with a, darker, more blue version of the green, which I don't have in the color palette, but I'm going to create it real quick. Again, when you download it, it's going to be in there. So once more, feel free to pause the video here if you need more time to work on these gradients. And once you're ready, we're going to move on to part 3, which is going to be refining these main shapes by adding some extra smaller shapes within them. Great. So we're going to start in the back once more, meaning we're going to start with some clouds behind the mountains. So you can go ahead and create a new layer and put it above the sky, but below everything else. Now this new layer, you can go ahead and rename it to clouds, of course. Now the clouds are going to be a very pale version of that kind of teal, greenish blue that we have in the sky. And in color palette, it is right here. And I'm going to go back, I think, with my selection tool here, but you could stick again with any brush that you're comfortable with. And here I'm really just going to draw some super quick, long clouds. So we're still not going into too much detail here, but it is going to help break up the sky a little bit. And I'm going to focus these clouds on the lower section of the sky. You could have them at the top as well, but I just like to really just keep them at the bottom for some reason. I think it just looks better for this piece. Now this section might be a little bit too pointy for a cloud. I'm just going to quickly go back to any kind of brush that allows me to properly erase, like a hard brush or a basic round brush. And I'm just going to slightly tweak that shape so it's not as harsh of a point. There we go. Now you could keep these clouds super opaque if you wanted to, but because we have a gradient in the sky, you might actually lower the opacity of the clouds layer so you see a tiny bit of that gradient behind them. It's really not going to be that noticeable, but it's still something that's worth doing. So going on the clouds layer, tapping on the little N next to the check mark, and probably just lowering the opacity around, I don't know, 80, 85, something like that. I'm going to keep my clouds on a separate layer, but if you wanted to at this stage, you could merge them with the sky. But I'm, again, just going to keep them separate. Now moving forward, we're going to draw some shadows to help us sculpt these mountains, because right now they're crazy flat. So we're just going to create a new layer above the mountains. And we're going to rename that new layer to Mountains Shadows. For these shadows, we're just going to use the exact same blue we used for the mountains themselves, which I know probably sounds crazy right now, but we're also going to use what is called a blending mode. And blending modes are in most software, so you should be able to find them in yours. Usually they are with the opacity of the layer. So in the case of Procreate, that means you can just tap on the little N next to the check mark, and under your opacity slider, you have this big list with a bunch of weird names. And the one we're looking for is multiply, which is super, super basic, so you should have it in your software as well. Now for now, we're going to leave the opacity as it is, but we might come back in and play with it later. And we're just going to go back to our selection tool to draw the right sides of each mountain. So that means coming in, for example, drawing this kind of wobbly line, and then following the actual shape of the mountain itself. Closing my selection and dropping my color onto it. So really just doing that for every single mountain we have, which I say every single, but I just have 3, so it's pretty quick. But it already gives so much more dimension to the piece. And you know what? I think I might actually... Should I leave that one without an edge? No, I'm going to add the smallest little one. Yeah, there we go. So I kind of like them really dark like this, but I might come back in and just lower the opacity a tiny little bit, probably around 70%, or maybe 75, yeah, something like that. Again, you can experiment and see what you prefer for your own piece. And now that we have this, we can actually come back in and draw some snow on top of the mountains, which is going to help them pop so much from the background. But that snow, we want it to be affected by the shadows. So we're going to create that snow layer between the mountains and the mountains shadows layer. Now I recommend renaming that layer to snow, of course. And for the snow, we're going to pick a super light version of the blue we've been using, which in the color palette is this one right here. And here I'm going to stick with my selection tool, but again, you can use a brush if you prefer. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to draw first just following the shape of the mountaintop itself, focusing on the top of the mountain, because that's where the snow is going to be in my case. But then I'm going to bring that in and draw some random little squiggles. So very similarly to what we did for the trees here, honestly, but this time it's going to be snow on a mountain. There we go. And at this point, you might be noticing that you're starting to have a lot of weird overlays or overlaps that are not perfectly aligned between the different mountain shapes we have. But that's really not a problem. There is a really cool tool that we can use that is also available in most software, and that tool is called Clipping Mask. So what we can do is we can apply the snow layer and the mountain shadow layer as clipping mask onto the mountain, and by doing that, these elements are going to stay within the mountain shape that we had initially, so it's going to eliminate all these weird overlaps. So let me show you an example. If I just go ahead and tap on the snow layer right here, I have the layer menu that opens up, and I have clipping mask as the option right there, which if I tap on it, now the snow is not poking out of the mountain anymore. There are some gaps, but those are really quick and easy to fill in. Now that we have a clipping mask, if I just come in with any kind of brush and I brush over them, they just disappear and I don't even have to worry about staying within the lines. Now we can do the exact same thing with the shadows, so they also stay within the mountain shape. So just tapping on a layer and selecting clipping mask. Now if you don't have clipping mask in your software, it's really not the end of the world. All you're going to have to do is come back in and try to make sure you paint within the lines. That being said though, I'm going to go back on my snow layer and I'm going to add snow on the other mountain tops as well. Now these shapes should be pretty simple, quick, and easy to do, but I do recommend once you have them mapped out, just coming back in with an actual brush, pretty small, and adding some extra little bits of snow, because right now it looks really quite stiff. So if you just come around and add some extra little dots here and there, or some random shapes and squiggles, I should say, it just helps the piece look a little bit better, I guess. More polished and refined. Let's go with that. And similarly, you can also come back in with your eraser, again just setting it the same brush you're using for your paintbrush, and erasing some blobs within the shape that you have. This is also something you do not want to overdo, but it can really just help break up that super solid snow shape that you would otherwise have. So feel free to pause the video here if you need more time to draw your snow. It shouldn't take too long though. It's really not something that you need to spend 30 minutes on. Just draw some basic shapes. It's still the background. It doesn't need to be super precise. Otherwise, once you're ready, we're going to move on to the next shape, which is this kind of hill right here. So the hills, we're going to do two things. One thing is going to be we're going to change the color ever so slightly between this hill in the front and this hill in the back. And so to do that, we can just use a selection tool once more, drawing a selection around the hill that we have. And here, it is okay if you have some gaps. It's actually going to help, gaps with the tree line, I should say. It is going to help with that tree line. So you're just going to roughly follow along the tree line that is on the left side. Then you're going to bring that line down towards the middle. And then you're going to bring it at the bottom. Again, if it's not perfect, it really does not matter. Now from there, we're going to fill this selection with a darker version of that blue, which in the color palette is this one in the middle of the column. It's really super hard to see, the difference between these two, but trust me, the middle one is a little bit darker than the top one, which is what we use for the mountains initially. So if you go with a slightly darker version of it, and then drag that onto the top of the mountain when we don't have the dark gradient, it's going to make that whole hill in the front a little bit darker. So that is step one, and you might actually not even see it in the video, but trust me, on screen you should be able to see it. Now step two is going to be coming in and adding some trees that would be in the light. So the mountain or the hill are going to be casting shadows kind of between themselves, but on some areas we're going to be able to see the trees. So for that, go ahead and just create a new layer above the hills, and you can rename that new layer to Forest. So once more here, you can use the selection tool or the brush, but we're going to come in with a kind of dark blue-green, which in the color palette is this one right here. I'm going to go with the selection tool just to be quick and efficient. And for these sections, you can draw an outline that uses this kind of wobbly shape for both the top and the bottom this time. So I'm going to hide my tree just so you can see what I'm about to do a little bit better, but sticking to my forest layer. So I'm going to pick my selection tool and just draw my little squiggles right here. To create this kind of shape, essentially. I'm going to do the same thing on the hill that is on the right, making sure that I don't forget that I have this distinction between the two hills. So essentially what I mean by that is I'm just going to go over and roughly follow the top edge of this hill, and then I'm going to come in and actually draw my highlight. So again, as you can see, I'm going super quick and dirty here. It doesn't need to look precise in any way. Just draw a rough shape that resembles mine, and that's really all you need to do. Now we're going to repeat this step with an even lighter green to tie in with that grass we have in the front. And for that, you can just use the same layer, but I like to create another one so that I can play with transparency as well. So I'm just going to create a new layer above the forest. I'm going to rename that new layer to Forest 2, I guess. There you go. And I'm going to pick that lighter, more yellow-green that I just told you about, which in the color palette, it's this one right here. Otherwise, same thing, either a brush or a selection tool. We're going to draw the same kind of shape, but this time focusing it on the top of the green section that we just created. Kind of like that. Doing it on the other side as well. There we go. Again, super, super quick. Now, as I mentioned, I kept my forest layer separate so that I could play with transparency, or the opacity, I should say. So I'm going to lower the opacity of that Forest 2 layer a little bit so that I can see Forest 1 through it more. So I'm probably just going to lower it around, I don't know, 85%, just so I see some of those very delicate overlaps on the top edges and the sides and stuff like that. Now we can also use a similar technique we used for the edges of the secondary pink on the tree, meaning we can come in and erase some parts of these forest layers. So I'm going to start with the original forest layer. And you could use the same kind of gritty brush that you use for the tree, but here I'm really just going to go with a soft brush. So free Procreate option would be in the airbrushing pack, the soft brush. If you're working with different software, just a round brush that has some feathering on the edges again is what I would recommend. But if you do have my inking, stippling, and texture bundle, we're going to pick from the texture pack the big soft layer builder. With a medium size, you're just going to come over and loosely, gently erase the bottom section of that shape. You don't want to fully erase it. You still want to see a little bit of that edge, but that way you're going to create a bit of a gradient in how that forest layer presents itself. Same thing on this side. There we go. And I might do the same thing on forest 2 as well, although probably a little bit less intensely as I did for the first forest layer, because I want that one to be pretty crisp, because it's like the highlight of the trees. Great. Now from there, we're going to go ahead and we're going to merge the hill and the forest layer so that we can use that to create the reflection in the lake. So again, to merge layers in Procreate, super easy. You can just squish them with 2 fingers. And to create the copy, it's also super easy. You're just going to duplicate your layer. So to do that in Procreate, you can just swipe it towards the left with 1 finger and then tap duplicate right here. Now from there, we're going to select the bottom copy. And we're going to use an arrow tool or any tool that allows us to do a mirror option, or mirror that layer, I should say. So in Procreate, it is the arrow tool right here. And we're going to see at the bottom, we have this new menu that pops up with flip vertical. So you're just going to tap on that. And that's going to first look crazy, but then if you come in and drag that shape so that the top of the shape align with the bottom of the original hills, it's going to start to look more like a reflection. Now to make it look more like a reflection as well, we're going to squish it. So using something like distort or freeform that once more allows you to not preserve the original proportions of that shape or that selection, we're just going to vertically squish it. So you're going to select the bottom handle here, and you're going to bring that upwards quite a bit. And to create the actual reflection look, we're going to lower the opacity of that layer, and we're also going to rename it just so we're not confused. So that bottom copy, the hills one that we have selected right now, we're going to rename that to reflection. And we are going to lower the opacity really quite a bit. So probably around 50% is what I would recommend, but once more you can experiment with that. Now you could keep it like that, or you could go back to the same eraser that you used to erase the forest layer and erase a little bit of that bottom edge right here. So I'm going to do that, setting my eraser to a slightly bigger size here because what we're erasing is bigger. I'm just going to gently erase to create a bit of a gradient within the reflection itself. So this is starting to look more like water, but to really amp up the water look, we're also going to add some very simple waves. So go ahead and create a new layer above the reflection layer, but still below the hills, and rename that new layer to water. Now for the water, you can use the same pale color that we use for the clouds, so this one right here. And once more, you can use a brush or a selection tool. All we're going to do here is we're going to draw some very flowy, almost groovy kind of shapes. So I like to just start mine with a selection tool so that I don't have too much control over them. But then I come back in with an eraser and a paintbrush to tweak them a little bit. So this kind of crazy shape essentially is what I'm looking for. I might add an extra one on this side. And you know what? I think I'm pretty happy with them. I don't even think I'm going to refine them, although I might just come in quickly and change that angle a tiniest little bit. Yeah, sure. Let's go with that. Right now, though, it looks absolutely insane, so we're going to play with the opacity of that layer. And yeah, you can just play with the opacity itself if you want, lowering it quite a lot. But if you want to have even more of a reflection and water vibe, you could just go ahead and scroll through blending modes if you want and see if there's one that would look right for this. So I think something like overlay or soft light would look really good. Yeah, I'm gonna go with overlay. It's just a tiny bit more interesting in how it plays with the color than just playing with the opacity. That being said, again, if you don't have blending modes, you can play with the opacity only, and that's going to look just fine as well. So once you're ready, we're going to move on to adding some details on the grass. We're going to essentially add two main elements here. One is going to be a little bit of a sign, and then another one is going to be some shadows. Now I'm drawing a sign just because I feel like I need to have something on that grass, but you could go ahead and draw something completely different. Like you could draw a character, you could draw a dog, an animal like a squirrel, whatever you want. I'm going to link a few different tutorials in the description below that you could use to add some sort of a character there. So I'm going to add some animal tutorials and some character tutorials. Again though, I'm going to just keep it simple and draw a sign. So I'm going to create a new layer above the grass, so above everything else we have so far, renaming that new layer to sign. And I'm going to use almost the same brown I used for the branches on the tree. So in the color palette, I'm going to pick this one right here. Now you could use a selection tool here, but I'm just going to use a round brush. And I'm going to draw first the post. Figuring out as I go, as you can see, and then drawing a rectangle for the sign. Now this sign, I want it to look quite rustic. I want it to look like it's made of wood, so I don't want it to be perfectly rectangle. I do want it to have a bit more of that organic shape to it. Now once you have the base shape of the sign, it's really easy because it is on a separate layer to just move it around so you're super happy with the composition. For example, I'm realizing zooming out that mine is way too small, so I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger. Quite a bit bigger actually. Might rotate it, move it around, maybe extend the post. Really, it's worth taking the time to make sure that that element you're putting in the foreground, you're super happy with it. It should not distract from the rest of the piece, but we don't want it to be so precise and interesting that it distracts from the rest of the piece, but we also don't want it to look so bad that it distracts from the rest of the piece because it just looks really out of place. So I think I'm going to go with that, although I might erase a little bit more of my post. Let's do that real quick. Make that a bit thinner. Leaving some kind of grass shapes for the bottom instead of just drawing a straight line. Yeah, just something like that. Now we're going to come back in and refine that sign, of course, but before that we're going to add some shadows on the grass, similarly to what we did for the mountains. So you can just go ahead, create a new layer below the sign but above the grass, and rename that new layer to Grass Shadow. Now once more, similarly to what we did for the mountains, if you do have clipping mask available in your software, we're going to apply that grass shadow layer as a clipping mask onto the grass so it stays within the shape of the grass. So just tapping on the layer and selecting clipping mask right here. And we're going to pick just the same original green color we used for the grass, so this one right here. And with that, you can come in either with a paintbrush or your selection tool. Here, I'm just going to stick with my base round brush. And to make it look like shadows, we're going to, just like we did for the mountains, use the blending mode multiply. So going back on the grass shadow layer, tapping on the little N here, and then selecting multiply. Now we're going to start by drawing a shadow that would be cast from the tree here onto the grass. So we're just going to use the same kind of shapes and draw those little squiggles on the grass itself. Now here you could use the selection tool if you wanted to, but because I use my paintbrush to draw the tree, I'm going to use a paintbrush to draw the tree shadow as well. And we're also going to draw a shadow behind whichever element you might have drawn on this side right here, so in my case the post. So we're just going to essentially reproduce that shape, but on the ground, so it's going to be horizontal and it's going to be squished a little bit. So I'm going to have the post, and then the sign itself. Now I feel like my shadows are just too intense, they're too distracting, so I'm going to lower the opacity of that grass shadow layer a little bit. Quite a lot actually, I'm saying a little bit, but I'm going to lower it around 47%. So once more, feel free to pause the video here if you need more time to work on those refined shapes. And once you're ready, we're going to move on to the very last step, which is going to be adding some details like floating petals, grass blobs, and some writings on the sign. Great, so at this stage we're ready to move on to the final details. Those are going to be super simple, but they're going to completely transform the piece. And we're going to start by just drawing some floating petals in the air. So go ahead and create a new layer above everything you have so far, and rename that new layer to Petals. And these petals are just going to be a lighter version of the pink you use, so you can just color pick that and manually make it almost white, but not quite. The exact color doesn't matter, so I'm not even going to bother having it in the color palette. There's already way too many colors in there. So just something super pale, but that still has a bit of pink in it. And then you can use the same basic round brush and just draw some little floating petals a little bit all over the place. And the idea here is obviously to focus most of these petals around the trees themselves, but you do want to have some that are floating away in the wind to really just bring that whole movement in the illustration. Now if you want, you could also add some details on the branches, and those I'm just going to draw them straight on the branch layer. It doesn't matter. And those details are just going to be darker version of the brown. So this one at the very bottom of the column right here in the color palette is what I'm going to use. And you can stick with the same round brush, or if you have my bundle, you can go back to the ultra smooth tracing, just like we used to draw the branches themselves, making it quite a bit smaller here. And just adding some very small lines, or simple lines I should say, that are going to make it look a little bit more like tree bark as opposed to this super flat brown thing. So this is another step that shouldn't take too long, but it does help just make that side a little bit more interesting. We're going to do something quite similar for the grass, meaning we're just going to amp up that texture of the grass a tiny bit by coming in and adding blobs of lighter and darker version of the green. Now these colors, I'm not going to add them in the color palette either because it depends on what you added or how you created your gradient. So you can just come in, color pick the top, like the paler section of that grass, make it quite a bit brighter, going on your grass layer of course, and then just draw some very simple little blobs like this, probably in groups of 2 or 3. You don't want to overdo it, maybe a couple groups, just kind of like this essentially. And then doing the same thing but with darker blobs, so just color picking at the bottom of your grass and making it darker this time. Just like that. Now the final thing we're going to do is adding some lights and shadows on the sign and maybe adding a bit of text as well, and that's going to be super simple. We're really just adding some final touches here, so you can go ahead and select the sign layer itself. Still with the same brush, whatever that is for you, we're going to come in and pick this lighter brown right here in the color palette. And we're going to start by outlining the left and top of the sign. Now we're also going to outline this top of the post, left and top of the post I should say, and a little bit of section on the bottom left side of the post. Now you could keep it like that if you want, but again, I'm going for something rustic, so I'm also going to add some highlights that are going to be part of the grain of wood, so just adding these very simple lines that are coming inside the sign. Now we're going to do the same thing but with shadows instead of lights. So in the color palette we're going to pick this dark brown at the bottom of the brown column. And this time we're going to add a shadow on the post right under the sign. So you can just draw a very simple line like this. Then create this kind of shape and fill it in to create the shadow. Now similarly to what we did with the lights to create the rustic wood effect, we're also going to add a shadow on the top of the post here. So same thing, this kind of curvy triangle. I might erase a little bit that light, and by erase I mean I'm just going to come back with my brown, my original brown, and paint over it. Yeah, that looks a bit better. But otherwise I'm going to come back in with my shadow color and also add some horizontal lines coming inwards to create that rustic wood effect, but this time focusing them on the right side of the sign. Great. And last but not least, we're going to write something on the sign, really whatever you want. You can write it on the sign layer itself, but just for safety, because I'm not the best at calligraphy, I'm going to create a new layer, which I'm going to rename to text. And you can write really whatever you want. I'm just going to go ahead and write spring, just using the shadow color we used, well, for the shadows, to make it look like it's engraved in the sign, essentially. And this is exactly why I went ahead and wrote on a separate layer. I almost am running out of space on this side. It's not really in the middle, so I'm just going to use my arrow tool and reposition that text so it's in the middle instead. And there you go. If you enjoyed this video and want more landscape and background tutorials, I highly recommend you check out this playlist because I have a bunch more for you. But before you leave, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I post every Saturday with bonus videos on some Tuesdays. Then click on the link right here and I'll meet you there.